Let's talk about the Acumatica process documentation tool prototype. Now this is a prototype, just an idea, but I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's a cool idea, and I think it could help a lot of people who are trying to document their process in Acumatica. Now before we look at the tool itself, let's step back and consider what it's like when you try to document a process in Acumatica. Now, first, if we step back and consider what are the ways of interacting with Acumatica. And for the purposes of this tool, we're just concerned with how we interact with Acumatica. I'm not concerned with things I might do outside of Acumatica as part of the process, like opening the mail or going and picking something out of an inventory bin. I'm just concerned about documenting what happens inside of Acumatica. So if we just confine ourselves to that what's done inside of Acumatica, then what are the ways we interact? Well, I've broken it down to 4 ways. I think you could really say 3, but I've got a reason, which we'll talk about later, why I've added the 4th one. First one is I just want to look at stuff. I want to review information in Acumatica. Second is I'm going to type on the keyboard. Third, I'm going to click with my mouse. And fourth, I've added what's really another click, but it's specifically for opening a new screen. And we'll talk more later about why I've added that 4th one. And then if you think about how you do those things, well, you review information with your eyes, you type stuff with your keyboard, and you click with your mouse. Now when you're documenting process, it's real easy to just start typing words and typing out a process. But there's some problems with that because it's harder for people to understand just the typed words. It's nice to have pictures along with it. And so what I've done is with these 4 ways of interacting with Acumatica, we've got 4 symbols or 4 icons for each one of these 4 things. So more on the icons. Let's consider words versus pictures. If we think about words, they're easier to create. I can start typing out my process really quickly. It's also easier to maintain, especially when I need to go back and insert something that I forgot in the process. I can just go back up to a previous paragraph, previous bullet point, and type in the stuff that I left out. But if you just have words, it's also less consistent from department to department as different people are documenting their processes. It's just a lot more flexibility with words and how you construct your sentences and paragraphs, leading to less consistent process documentation. And it's also harder, I think, for people to understand. Our brains just digest images and pictures better than words, or faster than words, I should say. So if we look at pictures, that's really the opposite of words. They are harder to create and harder to maintain, especially when you need to insert something you forgot, because pictures now are taking up space and you have to arrange things more carefully, deal with formatting a lot more. But when you get something documented with pictures, if you have a consistent set of icons, I think you have a more consistent process documentation. And also it's easier for people to understand just due to the nature of how our brains digest images better. And just to prove that point, if you look at all the words on the screen, you might be saying, well, which one's better, words or pictures? What's he trying to say here? Is he trying to say one's better than the other, or they're both needed? Not sure here. But if I just put up some icons, you can kind of get the point where I'm trying to say that it's about a tie. Words and pictures. I'm struggling because I want to use words, but I also want to use pictures, and I'm kind of not sure which one to go with. So we've got a tie here. And if you look at the pictures, it's a lot quicker for you to understand, well, yeah, we got 2 smiley faces, 2 frown faces, 2 frowns, 2 smileys. It's a tie between the 2. So just a reminder, our 4 icons from the last slide. Same idea here. We're trying to communicate, make things easier for people to understand by using icons, but I don't want to give up words either, because they're a lot easier to type and a lot easier to document stuff with. So before we go to the tool, let's consider the main existing tools that people use. And we're going to use this same spectrum. On the one hand, you can have it easier to create but harder to understand. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have it be harder to create and easier to understand. And if we go with that same words versus pictures analogy as earlier, and we look at what I think are the three main tools people use, just the office tools, Excel, Word, PowerPoint. In my opinion, I think Excel's on the far end of the spectrum. It's really easy to create, it's nice and structured, but it's also harder to understand. PowerPoint, harder to create, especially when you're needing to drag things, get even spacing between shapes, and then, oh, I forgot something, so now I need to go insert a shape and rearrange all the other shapes so things fit. I've got to make sure I fit right on the piece of paper. Oh, I can't fit it portrait, I got to go landscape. Now maybe I try to go legal size. It's just a lot more work to do it in PowerPoint, but the benefit being more picture oriented, it's easier to understand. And then Word, I think somewhere in between, I think more towards the Excel side, in that you can start doing some more pictures with Word. You can also do more of a bullet point structure, but I think it's still more in the Word category than in the picture category like PowerPoint. Now, what if there was another tool, and that's the goal of this presentation, some other tool that could give us the easier to create aspect of Excel and Word, but the easier to understand aspect of PowerPoint. Wouldn't it be nice for both of those things to exist in one tool? Well, let's see if what we've got would accomplish that. Now what I want to do is I want to document a simple process in Acumatica. Go ahead and refresh this, make sure I'm still logged in. And the place I'm going to document it, I've got everything lined up here on augforums.com/prototype process doc. So you go to augforums.com/prototype process doc. It'll take you to this page. And the process documentation tool for Acumatica, this prototype we've got, just depends on two things. Well, it really depends on one thing. One is a Google spreadsheet. And I did it this way so you could take this sample spreadsheet that we're about to build and you could create your own copy in your own Google Sheets area. The only thing you have to do is you have to share it publicly when you're done. Now, if you've ever shared a Google Sheet publicly, you can see it gets this really long, hard to guess URL, and unless you give that URL to someone, I still think it's pretty secure. But technically someone doesn't have to log in to see it, they just have to know what this URL is. So you do have to create it and share it publicly, and then once you do that, we'll do this a little bit later, but there's a link down here which actually takes us to the same spot, and then there's some parameters. The first one is the sheet itself, and you'll see starting with this 1RVV, that takes us all the way to the RDC at the end. Here's the RDC. So all you do is you take this piece out of your Google Sheet and you paste it after the sheet parameter here. Then there's one more parameter called process, and our process is going to be called sample. The reason I put a process parameter in here is you might want to document more than one process in the same Google Sheet, and this is going to tell you which one you want to print out, so to speak, and I'll show you what I mean by print out in a little bit later here. So let's start off with the Google Sheet. Let's see, if I click that, it opens it up in a new tab, and I've got two tabs down here. One is the data tab, the second one is the validation tab. Now the validation tab is where we need to list out the process. So here's where if we were doing more than one process in this Google Sheet, I might have more than one thing listed here. I'll just go with sample for now. Then you do have to put in a list of who is doing something. You might put a person's name here, you might put a department, a job description, however you want to do it. The goal is put it here first so it then validates your data entry back on the data tab. And same thing with the screens, and then here's these are going to translate into those 4 icons that we looked at earlier. So these, you won't need to mess with these, but you'll probably need to add in the additional screens that you're documenting. And you'll see the naming convention that I use is I use the screen name in Acumatica, and then in parentheses I put the screen ID just to make it crystal clear which screen I'm talking about, because sometimes you've got some screens that have the same name but different IDs. Alright, so let's see, and actually this is a good example because this is actually the printed purchase order form. This is the purchase orders data entry screen. So by putting the ID, it just makes it more clear which one I'm talking about. So you'd set this part up first, and it basically boils down to who's doing it, where are they doing it, and what are they doing, and then the process that we're documenting itself. So let's come back here and let's start documenting a process. So I'm going to keep flipping back and forth between Acumatica and my Google Sheet. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the purchase order screen, and it's actually this one, the PO30-1000 screen that I'm going to open up here. So I just opened a screen, so let's document that. The process that we just did, this whole thing that we're doing is going to be all one process. We're calling it our sample process. We're going to give each step in the process a number, starting with number 1. We're going to say who does each thing in the process. So I'm going to say the buyer is doing this first step. Where they did it, we did it in the purchase order screen. And in this case, we don't need a where field, but what did we do? We opened a screen. Done with step 1. Alright, then the next step is I come back here and I select a vendor. So I put in the AA vendor. So I populated the vendor field with a value. Alright, so I'm going to copy down the process. Let's see, we'll do that. This is step number 2. The buyer's still the person doing it. I'm still on the purchase order screen, so I'll just paste that down. And then where am I doing this? It's in the vendor field. So the naming convention I use is I just type the field name. And then what did I do? I entered some data into that field. Alright, and then let's keep going. So then I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go into the document details tab. I'm going to go into the vendor ID field and select an item. Let's do the laptop. So there I went into the the inventory ID field on the document details tab. So step 3, the buyer's still doing this. I'm still on the same screen, and the naming convention I use here is I type in the tab name just as you see it on the screen. I use the dash arrow, and then I type the field name if it's a field inside of a tab, and I'm still entering data. I might do a couple more things. I want to make sure I enter the warehouse. Maybe it doesn't default, so I want to make sure I document that I need to enter the warehouse. And let me do a couple things here. I'll do order quantity. Let's put in 2 and unit cost. And maybe it defaults, but I also need to enter the unit cost. Like that. So let's come back here. So what did I do? I did 3 more steps, 4, 5, and 6. It's the buyer and the screen the whole time, and I'll even paste this down. But what I did is I went into the warehouse field, then I went into the order quantity field, and then I went into the unit cost field. And here's where I like a spreadsheet, because you can see it's real easy to start documenting once you get the hang of it. I can copy and paste stuff down because I have the structure that a spreadsheet provides. I think spreadsheet is nice structure for getting a process documented, putting the information into the documentation side of it. Now at this point I want to go further, but before we go further, let's come back to our prototype process doc tab here. And now let's take a look at this second link. So I had to create a Google Sheet, and I should also show you this part. I've already done this, but I'll show it to you. You do have to click the share button and use this get shareable link. Once you do that, you'll get this link down here, and make sure that it says anyone with the link can view it. So this is a public link, and this is the link that I've already pasted back here, starting with the docs.google.com. Then this second link down here, if I click on this, now right now you can see it says prototype process doc in the top, nothing after it. If I click this link down here, it's taking us to the same page, but it put the extra stuff at the end of it. So once you create your own Google Sheet, and to do that actually, you'll be able to go to this sample sheet. Once we're done creating it, you'll be able to see this because it's public, and you can just use File and make a copy to make your own copy in your own Google Drive folder. Put it wherever you want. The main thing is once you make a copy and you have your own version that you can edit, then you need to hit the share button, anyone with a link, and then the only part that you really need to copy is the part after the D. So if I were to take this, let me just take this and put it in Notepad just to be crystal clear here. You don't care about this stuff, the /edit, and you don't care about anything, the /d/ anything before it. It's just this part. That's what you would need to copy, and then you would need to replace what's right here with whatever your link is. Now in my case, there's nothing to replace because I'm already using this sample link. So hopefully that's clear. And then what you put in the process parameter sample corresponds to whatever you put in this process column. So here's where you could wind up with additional rows that now have a different process value, and if you wanted to print them, you would just change that process value. It wouldn't be sample, it would be whatever you chose. Alright, so you can see when I do that and I put that up in the URL, now what it does is it gives me what I think is a more easily understood printed version of that process. Now let's take a look at what's happening. First thing that happens is I get a black background, white letters line telling me who is doing this. So I know whenever I have a black background section, I know that I need to pay attention to the who. Everything underneath it, it's going to be the same person doing it. A gray background means a screen change. In this case, I can tell I had to consciously open the screen because I've got the open screen icon. And which screen was it? Well, it tells me right here. That's step one. Step two is I go into the vendor field. Now, I know that it's for the last gray line that appeared. Everything under that gray line is now on that screen. So the vendor field is on the purchase order screen. Document details is on the purchase order screen. And what am I doing on each one of these steps? I'm entering data, and there's my enter data icon right there. So I think this is easier to understand. It's also more consistent because you've got these consistent 4 icons. I know I'm only doing one of 4 things on each one of these steps. And I've got a nice who indicator with a black background. I've got a screen indicator with a gray background. So let's go a little bit further. Let's say that I also want to have the buyer, after I enter this information, I want to have the buyer review some vendor information. So I'm going to click the pencil icon to open up the vendor record. So let's document that. Come back here. This will be step number 7. Still the buyer's doing it. Still on the purchase order screen, but it was the vendor field, and I'll use the dash arrow convention again, and I'll just say pencil icon. Now this time I didn't enter data, I clicked a button. So I'll say click button. Alright, and then what happened? It actually opened a second tab up here and it took me to the vendor screen. And then what do I want to have them do? I want to have them review the information Let's say maybe I want to have them review the payment settings and the remittance address just to make sure that it's correct before I place this PO. So let's document that. First thing what happened is a screen opened. It was another screen. It's still the buyer who's doing it, but now I've got the vendor screen here. And I'm not going to put in a field because it just opened on its own. And if I didn't consciously click the screen, my convention is to use the review info icon. And you'll see what happens when I do that. Then what did I do on that screen? Still the buyer on the vendor screen. I'm having them go to the payment settings tab and look at the remittance address. And all I'm doing is reviewing the information, not entering data, not clicking on something, just reviewing it. And then I've also got this notes column just to put in some additional notes. So maybe I want to say correct the address if needed. Alright. And then the next thing I would have them do is when I'm done, I would close the tab. So I want to document that as well. I'll say the buyer on the vendor screen needs to close the tab. And to do that, I click the button on the tab. Alright, so now I'm back. Once I close that tab, I'm back on the purchase order screen. And because I'm back on the purchase order screen, I do want to document that I'm now on a new screen, but because I didn't click that screen to open it, it was already there, I'm going to use that same review info icon. And then the next thing I want to do is I'll do reports, print purchase order. So let's flip back and document that. Still the buyer, now I'm on the purchase order screen. Reports, print purchase order. And to do that, that was clicking a button. And now I've got my printed version of the purchase order. Now this was also another screen that opened up. This is that PO 64-1000 purchase order. And I do want to have the buyer review the information there. So I want to note that the buyer should be reviewing. Now it's a new screen though, so before I have them review the information, I want to indicate a screen change. I didn't really I didn't open that screen consciously, it just came from the previous action, so I'll use that review info again. Then on step 14, I'll say on the same report, I want to review all fields. So we're going to say review info icon, and then I'll put in additional notes to review to ensure accuracy. Alright, now before we go further, let's come back. And we've already got things queued up to point to our Google Sheet to tell it to look at the sample process. So let's refresh this. And now if I scroll down, you'll see I've still got the buyer up on the top, the screen, but if I scroll down, you'll notice here's another gray line. So the screen changed to the vendor screen. There's no icon here, and that's telling me that it just happened by the previous action. It wasn't a conscious screen open. But now I know what's happening in this gray section is related to this vendor screen. So here's my payment settings, remittance address, there's my review information icon, and here's that note that I added. So that gets printed as well. Then I've got a button click icon telling me to close the tab. That took me back to the purchase order screen. Then on the purchase order screen I did reports, print purchase orders, or print purchase order, and that was done with a button click. Which then opened the purchase order form, not consciously, that's why there's no icon here, just happened from the previous action. And I need to review all fields, and there's my note, review to ensure accuracy. So I think you get the idea. I'm just going to do some remaining examples here, and then we'll look at the final printed version of this. Let me just make this a little faster. I'm typing this off a printed version. This is not coming out of my head. So I know what I want to do. Let me just crank it out here. This is going to be more steps and all related to the sample process. Alright, so after the buyer reviews all the fields, then what we'd want the buyer to do is hit the print button to print the purchase order. So we're still on the purchase order form, print, and that's a button click. And then I also want to put a note in here. The notes can be used to record that stuff that's going to happen outside of Acumatica. I don't want that to be the primary focus of this process documentation, but I do have a way to do that. I'm just going to record a note to say, go send the PO to the vendor. Maybe I'll say, this is a more antiquated process, so instead of emailing it, I want to mail the PO to the vendor. Okay, so let's see. Next, I also want to have the buyer close down the tab. So I'll say close tab. And that's done with a button click. And when I do that, so let's go ahead and, oh, I'm sorry, don't want to close tab. I want to hit the back button. I'll call this the browser back button. Now normally that should have taken us to our PO. Not sure why it didn't. Normally that should take us back to where we were here. And then what else do I need to do? I need to uncheck the hold box here. So let's record that. Still the buyer, still, now I'm on actually the purchase order screen, so let's copy that down. So whenever I have a screen change, I'm just going to do this review info as the first step. Then the next step is where I'll record the what I'm actually doing. So I uncheck the hold box. So that was a button click on the hold checkbox. And I want to record a note here, uncheck once the PO placed with the vendor. Now I know this is a live PO. Okay, and then I also want to press the save button. So let's go ahead and indicate that as well. And that was a button click. Alright, so now let's switch people. Let's say that I'm now the purchasing manager and I'm going to go into Acumatica. Now for the sake of time, I'm not going to log in as another user, but normally we'd have the purchasing manager go in and go to the approval screen. Now because I'm not in as that right person, we're not able to see that here, but we'd have them go in, we'd have them click the checkbox and then click the approve button. So to record that, I'm going to have the purchasing manager on the approval screen. Now this is a conscious screen open, so I'm going to use the open screen icon. And then what do? They just go check the box. That's with the button click. And then they click the approve button with a button click. So that's purchasing manager. Once it's approved, let's go back to the PO. So let's say the purchasing manager did their job. I'm back on the PO, so this now would have been approved already. So I'll just go ahead and do that action. Now I'm open. And let's see. Now I've got a live PO. So now let's say I'm the person in receiving. So I'm going to go to the purchase receipt screen. So this is the screen, the PO 32,000 that I want to go to. So this will do, who's doing this? Receiving is doing this. And where are they doing it? In the purchase receipt screen. And this was a conscious screen open, so the open screen icon. Then what am I going to do here? The first thing I need to do is I need to put in the vendor. So that was the vendor field. I entered data. And then I come down here and I use the Add PO Line button. So that was down, same screen, that was in the document details. And that was a button click. And then I would select off the POs that I'm going to add. So I'll just put a button click for checkboxes. And I'll put a note, select POs to add. Now I think we can improve on this, and the main reason why I'm recording this video is to get feedback. What do you think? Is this a nice tool or not that great? You're happy using PowerPoint or whatever you use, but I'm also interested in ways to improve this. I think we could come up with maybe an icon or some way of indicating that you're going to loop through things. So you might have one or multiple things to do in an area, and so for now I'm just documenting you're going to check some boxes, but there might be a good reason to put an icon specially for that, or have some way of formatting that when you're adding multiple lines, or you might have a series of steps that you might need to repeat. Might be just handled in a note, maybe you reference a step number. Not sure, I haven't thought through that part of the scenario. This is a prototype and I'm looking for feedback here. Alright, so I'm going to check some boxes, and then when I'm done, I scroll down, I'm going to click the Add and Close button. So here's the Add and Close. That was a button click. And then once that's back, depending on your environment, in my environment, the receipt quantity automatically populated, but maybe your environment does not. So you want to add another step here. That receiving needs to make sure they go into that document details tab, receipt quantity field, and they need to enter the quantity received. Then when they're all done, looks like I missed one step here. We would want them to come up here, and now I think in most environments this crate bill is not checked, so I'm going to assume in your environment it's not checked. So the next thing they would do is just click the release button. Alright, let's come back here, let's refresh it, and let's take a look at our completed process. We've already seen this top part. We've seen how the gray line indicates a screen change. If there's no icon, it means a screen change that happened because of the previous step. If I close the tab, that brought me back to this screen. I printed a report, that launched this next screen. So this is a nice visual way for my eyes to see what's happening on each screen. I also have these nice icons to give me that quick feedback. What does this step represent? Step number 14, it's a review information step. This is a button click step. What am I doing? That's coming right after the step number, but I have the ability to put in those additional notes. Here's another screen change. And so the goal here is to give you flexibility with the words, but consistency with the images and with these backgrounds. So you have a blend of the two. So I have flexibility in how I say what it is I'm doing. I try to put the field names or the tab in the field name or the button name, and then use the notes for any additional information. So here's the save, last action, and then this black background comes in again whenever the who changes. So I'm recording on every single step who's doing it, where it's taking place, but it only prints that black background or that gray background when it changes. So this gives me a nice visual way to know, okay, now the purchasing manager is doing this part. Where are they doing it? Because that was a conscious screen open, I get that open screen icon. And what are they doing? They're clicking some checkboxes, clicking the approve button. And then the last part was back in receiving. So I get the black background again. Receiving's doing this part now. And Got the gray background to show me what screen they're doing it on, all the way down to the end where they click the release button. Now, hopefully that wasn't too tedious. I wanted to demonstrate how we could document a whole process, have the nice convenient way of just doing it in a spreadsheet. I think it's easier to get information in that way. I'm not worried about formatting here. When you get into trying to draw pictures or do PowerPoint, you're constantly running into formatting, and it really slows you down. This way, I'm just typing. I'm just documenting my process. I've got a real structured approach to it, and once you pick up the structure and you add in your own style of how you do it, you can start to do this really quickly. And it's also very detailed. We're documenting every single click, every interaction with Acumatica, whether it was with the keyboard, whether it was with the mouse. And the reason why we had that fourth option, not just a click but an open screen, was so we could get the ability to know whether it was a conscious screen open or the screen just changed as a result of a previous step. That's why I added that fourth icon. And then we even are capturing whether we're just reviewing something in Acumatica. But we're capturing the process at a very detailed level. Click by click, keystroke by keystroke, even reviewing information. And that's really important for documenting a process, because there's multiple ways that you can do things in Acumatica. And we really want to get the steps documented so people can understand how to do it in Acumatica. Also, you might have someone who's been running Acumatica for a while. You might have two different people document their processes, and you might find they do things very differently. And you can either have one person learn from the other, or they both might learn from each other and come up with a better process, a third process that's kind of a combination of the two. And I think this is really important for anyone who's in a new implementation, for training purposes. I think it's also really important to have process documented for when you have employee turnover. That's one reason why people buy new systems, is because the knowledge of the old system is just in people's heads and it's not documented. You want to prevent that when they get on a new system like Acumatica. So we all know that process documentation is important. It just tends to be a last priority. It doesn't happen a lot of times because of the challenge of doing it. And so the goal with this prototype tool is to take away some of that challenge, give you a streamlined, structured way to document the process, but also give you a nice visual way to consume the process. So I'd love to get feedback on this. What do you think? Is it a good tool? I'm pretty excited about it, but maybe you don't think it's that great. And again, all you do is take that Google Sheet, you can copy it to your own Google environment, make sure you share it publicly, and then just replace, when you click on this, replace this part of the link up on the top, and you'll see it print out whatever process you documented in your own Google Sheet. So that's it. I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully you're excited about this as I am.